Captain Kalen of the Vlisk Dominion fleet stood on the bridge of his warship, the Inexorable, watching the human medical transport drift helplessly through space. The vessel's engines had been disabled by precision fire from his gunners. A clean, efficient strike that had minimized structural damage while rendering the ship completely immobile. Just as he'd ordered. Status report, he demanded, his four-fingered hand adjusting the ceremonial rank insignia at his collar. The metallic scales across his face caught the light as he turned toward his tactical officer. All human communication systems have been neutralized, Captain. Life support remains functional but degraded. Scans show approximately 30 human life signs, many fading. Kalen nodded with satisfaction. The Vlisk Dominion had been locked in this costly, dragging war with the humans for nearly 3 standard cycles. Humans were technologically inferior in almost every measurable way, yet they continued to resist with an inexplicable tenacity that both frustrated and intrigued the Vlisk High Command. Prepare boarding parties, Kalen ordered. Priority objectives are intelligence, gathering, and prisoner acquisition. The medical personnel will be particularly valuable for biological research. In Vlisk society, efficiency and discipline were paramount. The rigid military hierarchy that governed all aspects of their civilization had been perfected over millennia. Lower-ranked individuals existed to serve the needs of the greater system, their lives expendable if the strategic calculus demanded it. This was simply logical, a truth as fundamental as gravity. The boarding shuttle sliced through the void toward the crippled human vessel. Kalen led the mission personally, a rare occurrence. But this particular ship might contain valuable intelligence about human physiological vulnerabilities. Such information could potentially shorten the war by months, saving thousands of Vlisk lives. What they found inside the transport was chaos. The ship had been more severely damaged in the interior than external scans had indicated. Emergency lighting cast eerie red shadows across corridors littered with debris and bodies. The air smelled of burned circuitry and the distinctive copper tang of human blood. Spread out. Secure any survivors, Kalen ordered his squad. Remember, medical personnel are priority targets. He moved deeper into the vessel, following the sound of urgent activity. Rounding a corner into what appeared to be the main treatment bay, Kalen stopped abruptly. A lone human female knelt on the floor beside a fallen Vlisk soldier. The soldier wore the markings of a forward scout unit, likely captured during a previous engagement and being transported for interrogation. What was remarkable, however, was that the human wasn't cowering or attempting to flee. Instead, she was performing some kind of medical procedure on the Vlisk, her hands steady and precise despite the blood, both crimson human and silvery Vlisk, that covered them. Step away from him, human, Kalen commanded, raising his weapon. The woman didn't even look up. Can't. Arterial rupture. He'll bleed out if I stop now. Her audacity was shocking. Kalen moved closer, signaling 2 of his soldiers to flank her. Now he could see that she was using improvised tools, some recognizable medical instruments and others cobbled together from ship components, to staunch the bleeding from a severe wound in the scout's thoracic cavity. You are now property of the Vlisk Dominion, Kalen informed her coldly. Release the soldier and surrender yourself. At this, the woman finally looked up, her eyes flashing with defiance. I'm not property, Captain. I'm Dr. Alara Vance, Chief Medical Officer of the UNSS Mercy, and I don't surrender patients mid-procedure, not even enemies. She returned her attention to her work. If you want this soldier to live, you'll let me finish. Or shoot me and explain to your superiors why you executed one of your own. The sheer insubordination left Kalen momentarily speechless. Humans were known to be emotional and irrational, but this one's behavior defied all tactical sense. She had no leverage, no escape route, and yet she spoke as if dictating terms. Why would you attempt to save an enemy combatant? He asked, genuinely curious despite himself. Hippocratic oath, she replied tersely, her focus on her work. I treat the wounded regardless of who they are. Now, if you're staying, make yourself useful and hand me that clamp. For reasons he couldn't fully articulate, Kalen found himself complying, watching with clinical interest as the human doctor deftly repaired the damaged vessels in the scout's chest. "Will he survive?" Kalen asked after several minutes of observing her work. "If infection doesn't set in, your physiology is different from ours, but the principles are similar enough." She sat back on her heels, exhaustion evident in her posture. "He's stabilized for now." Kalen gestured to his soldiers. "Take her to the shuttle. Bring the wounded scout as well." He studied the human doctor more carefully. She was small by Vlisk standards, her skin pale, with dark hair pulled back from her face. Yet there was nothing fragile about her demeanor. "You have medical knowledge of Vlisk physiology," he stated. "That makes you more valuable than a typical prisoner." "Lucky me," she replied dryly, rising to her feet. For the first time, Kalen noticed the insignia on her blood-stained uniform, some kind of serpent wrapped around a staff. An appropriate symbol for such a dangerous creature, he thought. The journey back to Kalen's command ship was uneventful, but once they arrived, a crisis erupted that would alter the trajectory of both their lives. Captain, his second-in-command, Subcommander Vex, met them at the docking bay, his normally stoic demeanor visibly disturbed. "We have an emergency in the barracks. 20 soldiers have collapsed with some kind of seizure-inducing illness. The medical unit is overwhelmed." Kalen frowned. "A human biological weapon?" "Unknown, sir. It began shortly after the boarding party returned from a previous mission. Dr. Sarvin believes it may be an environmental contaminant or pathogen from the human colony on Nexus 4. Kalen's mind raced through the strategic implications. The afflicted soldiers included several key specialists whose expertise couldn't be easily replaced. Their loss would significantly impact the ship's combat effectiveness. "Take me to them," he ordered, then hesitated before adding, "Bring the human doctor as well." The scene in the medical bay was one of controlled chaos. Vlisk medical officers moved with clinical precision between the afflicted soldiers, but their tense body language betrayed their confusion. The ship's chief medical officer, Dr. Sarvin, approached Kalen with obvious reluctance. "Captain, we've been unable to identify the pathogen or toxin responsible. It appears to target the central nervous system, causing increasingly severe seizures. We've lost 3 already." Alara Vance, still flanked by guards, studied the nearest patient with evident professional interest. "Your diagnostics?" she asked Dr. Sarvin directly, as if they were colleagues rather than captor and prisoner. The Vlisk physician bristled at her presumption, but looked to Kalen for guidance. After a moment's hesitation, Kalen nodded. "We've ruled out common neurotoxins and viral agents," Sarvin explained stiffly. "Blood chemistry shows elevated neurotransmitter levels, but the cause remains elusive." Alara moved closer to one of the afflicted soldiers, her eyes narrowing as she observed the pattern of muscular contractions. "Have any of them consumed human food or medications? Handled human biological materials without protection?" "Negative," Sarvin replied. "All contact protocols were followed." "What about the environment on Nexus 4? Atmospheric composition, local flora?" "Standard terraformed conditions. Nothing unusual in preliminary surveys." Alara frowned, then suddenly straightened. "The water," she said. "Did they drink local water or use it for washing?" Sarvin hesitated, then checked his datapad. "Affirmative. The landing party used local water sources for basic hygiene. Our filters detected no contaminants." "They wouldn't," Alara said with growing excitement. "May I?" She gestured toward the diagnostic equipment. When Kayla nodded again, she quickly adjusted the settings and ran a new scan on the nearest patient. "There," she said triumphantly, pointing to a pattern on the display that meant nothing to Kalen. "Hexaneurotic alkaloids. They're found in certain amphibious life forms on human-compatible worlds. Harmless to us, but they bind to Vlisk neural receptors, based on what I could see of your physiology." "The treatment," Sarvin demanded, professional interest overcoming his initial hostility. "You need an enzyme inhibitor," Alara replied, already moving to the medical synthesizer. "Something to block the alkaloid from binding to neural tissue and accelerate its breakdown in the bloodstream." "Our standard protocols," Sarvin began. Won't work, Ilara interrupted. Your standard neural blockers will worsen the condition. I need access to your pharmaceutical database and synthesis equipment. Kalen made a swift decision. Grant her access. Full monitoring. For the next 3 hours, Kalen watched as the human doctor worked alongside Vlisk medical personnel, her approach wildly unorthodox by their standards. She improvised equipment configurations, combined compounds in ways that made Sarvin visibly uncomfortable, and applied treatments with a fluid adaptability that contrasted sharply with the rigid Vlisk medical protocols. Most remarkably, it worked. The seizures subsided, and the affected soldiers began to stabilize. When the final patient had been treated, Ilara sank into a chair, visibly exhausted. Your methodology is unstructured, Sarvin observed, something like reluctant respect in his voice. Medicine isn't always about following protocols, Ilara replied. Sometimes you have to adapt to the patient in front of you. Nevertheless, your intervention was effective, the Vlisk doctor acknowledged stiffly. Kalen, who had observed the entire procedure, approached Ilara. You've proved your value, Dr. Vance. The High Command will be most interested in your knowledge. Ilara met his gaze steadily. Does that mean I'm to be a research specimen rather than a prisoner of war? It means, Kalen replied carefully, that your conditions of captivity will reflect your usefulness. What neither of them realized in that moment was how profoundly this human doctor would challenge not just Vlisk medical practices, but the very foundations of their society. 2 standard cycles later, Ilara had been transferred to the Central Medical Research Facility on the Vlisk Military Station Dominance Prime. Captain Kalen, much to his surprise, had been assigned to oversee her integration. Ostensibly because of his first-hand experience with her capabilities, but he suspected it was also a test of his loyalty after he had advocated for her unusual treatment. The facility was the pinnacle of Vlisk medical technology, a gleaming complex of laboratories and treatment centers where the most promising medical advances were developed for military application. Resources were allocated strictly according to strategic value, with the most sophisticated care reserved for high-ranking officers and specialists. Ilara's position was unprecedented, a human practitioner with limited access to Vlisk medical systems, working under constant surveillance. Her official designation was Biological Intelligence Asset, a carefully neutral term that acknowledged her value without granting her any defined status in the rigid Vlisk hierarchy. From the beginning, she caused disruption. Why is this soldier still waiting? Ilara demanded on her 3rd day, pointing to a lower-ranked infantry trooper who sat in a treatment area, clearly in pain from a badly broken limb. The supervising Vlisk medical officer, Lieutenant Merrick, barely glanced up from his console. Triage protocols. Combat specialists receive priority. He's scheduled for treatment after the current queue is processed. He's been waiting for 6 hours. The bone needs to be set properly before tissue damage becomes permanent. The resource allocation is optimal for overall unit effectiveness, Merrick replied dismissively. One infantryman's discomfort is statistically insignificant. Without warning, Ilara moved to the soldier's side and began examining the injury. I'll treat him now. Merrick rose from his station, mandibles clicking in agitation. You exceed your authority, human. Return to your assigned tasks. Kalen, who had been observing from a monitoring station, intervened before the situation could escalate. Lieutenant, allow Dr. Vance to proceed. Considered an assessment of her technical capabilities with this type of injury. Merrick subsided reluctantly, and Ilara proceeded to treat the injured soldier with an efficiency that even the Vlisk medical staff couldn't criticize. What was remarkable, however, was how she spoke to the soldier throughout the procedure, explaining what she was doing, asking about his comfort level, engaging him as an individual rather than a component of the military machine. When she finished, the soldier flexed his newly stabilized limb with obvious relief. Gratitude, medical officer, he said, using the formal acknowledgement typically reserved for Vlisk doctors. My name is Ilara, she replied with a small smile. And you're welcome. It was a minor incident, but it established a pattern. Ilara consistently defied the facility's hierarchical treatment protocols, allocating her time and skills based on medical need rather than rank. She improvised equipment and procedures when standard protocols proved inefficient, saved patients deemed non-viable by VLISC medical calculations, and worst of all, from the perspective of facility administrators. She explained her reasoning to the VLISC medical staff who worked with her. The issue isn't just about saving one life, she told a group of VLISC medical technicians during an impromptu teaching session that Kaylin observed via surveillance. It's about what attempting to save every life does to us as healers. Once you start calculating which lives are worth saving, you've compromised something fundamental to good medicine. Efficiency requires prioritization, one technician argued. Resources are finite. Of course they are, Ilera agreed. But there's a difference between making difficult choices in a crisis and institutionalizing the devaluation of certain lives as standard practice. Kaylin found himself increasingly preoccupied with these philosophical exchanges. They represented a fundamental challenge to VLISC social organization, yet he couldn't dismiss them entirely. Not when the medical outcomes in Ilera's section of the facility were showing measurable improvement. The situation came to a head when a maintenance accident severely injured a low-ranked technician. The facility's automated triage system classified his case as non-priority due to the extensive resources required for treatment and the victim's low strategic value. Ilera, who happened to be nearby when the accident occurred, immediately took charge of the scene. "Get him to Surgical Bay 3, she ordered, as if she had the authority to commandeer VLISC medical resources. Dr. Sarvin, who had also been transferred to the facility and now served as Ilera's nominal supervisor, blocked her path. "The system determination is final, Dr. Vance. The resources required for this case exceed his statistical value to the Dominion." "Move aside, Doctor," Ilera said quietly, "or help me save him. Those are your only ethical options." "Ethics is subordinate to efficiency," Sarvin replied coldly. "That is the foundation of VLISC medicine." "Then your foundation is rot," Ilera snapped, "and everything you build on it will eventually collapse." The confrontation might have ended there, with Ilera being disciplined or restricted, if not for an unexpected development. 3 VLISC medical technicians who had been working with Ilera stepped forward. "We will assist Dr. Vance," one said, careful to keep his eyes lowered in the presence of his superiors. Sarvin's scales flushed with the VLISC equivalent of anger. "You will be reported for protocol violation." "Noted, sir," the technician replied, but didn't back down. Kaylin, watching from his usual observation post, made a split-second decision. "Allow the procedure," he ordered through the communication system. "Full documentation for analysis." What followed was a 12-hour surgical marathon in which Ilera, assisted by the VLISC technicians and eventually even Dr. Sarvin, whose curiosity overcame his initial resistance, essentially rebuilt the injured technician's shattered body. She improvised techniques, repurposed equipment, and at several points jury-rigged solutions to problems that the VLISC medical database classified as non-survivable. Against all statistical probability, the technician survived. The incident created ripples throughout the facility. The technicians who had assisted Ilera were formally reprimanded, but also commended for the technical innovation they had demonstrated. Dr. Sarvin submitted a detailed report on the procedural variations Ilera had introduced, carefully framing them as potentially valuable for treating high-value personnel in crisis situations. And Kaylin found himself facing an uncomfortable truth. The human doctor's approach, for all its apparent emotional basis, was producing results that the VLISC system could not ignore. 6 months after Ilera's arrival at the facility, a crisis erupted on the contested planet Xylos. A major VLISC offensive had encountered unexpected resistance, resulting in catastrophic casualties. The field medical units were overwhelmed, and the survival rate for wounded soldiers had dropped to an unacceptable level. In a move that shocked even Kaylin, the High Command ordered Ilera's deployment to the front lines. She was to be sent to the main field hospital on Xylos, with Kaylin continuing his role as her supervisor and security guarantor. The orders came with an ominous addendum. Asset effectiveness to be maximized, containment of ideological contamination essential. They understood the danger she represented, Kalen realized, not as a conventional security threat, but as a carrier of ideas that could undermine Vlisk military discipline. Yet they needed her skills badly enough to take the risk. The battlefield hospital on Xylos was a nightmare of efficiency pushed to its breaking point. The massive prefabricated structure hummed with activity as medical teams processed wounded soldiers according to strict triage protocols. Those classified as likely to return to combat were prioritized. Those with injuries requiring extensive resources were often designated for palliative care only, a euphemism for being kept comfortable until death. Alara surveyed the scene with professional calm, but Kalen could see the tension in her posture. "Your assignment is a surgical unit 4, he informed her. "You will work under Colonel Drav's supervision." "And my parameters?" she asked quietly. "You will follow facility protocols," Kalen replied, knowing even as he said it that she would not. "Then a lot of your people will die unnecessarily," Alara said simply. "Is that acceptable to you, Captain?" Before he could answer, an alarm sounded, signaling the arrival of a new wave of casualties. Colonel Drav, a grizzled veteran with decades of battlefield medicine experience, approached them. "The human asset," he said, acknowledging Alara with a curt nod. "Your reputation precedes you. Unconventional but effective, according to reports." "I'm a doctor, not an asset," Alara replied. "And I'll need authority to modify treatment protocols if I'm going to make a difference here." Drav's facial scales rippled in what Kalen recognized as amusement. "Modified protocols require demonstration of superior outcomes, Doctor. You'll have your chance to prove your methods." And prove them she did. Within hours, Alara had established herself as a force of nature in the chaotic hospital. She moved with tireless energy from one case to another, making rapid, decisive interventions that often contradicted standard Vlisk medical practice but consistently yielded better results. She triaged patients based on survivability rather than rank, redirected resources when conventional treatments failed, and most disturbingly to the Vlisk medical hierarchy, taught her techniques to anyone who would listen. The femoral artery analog in Vlisk anatomy is more resilient than in humans, she explained to a group of medics as she demonstrated a repair technique. "You can use this clamp design to create tension without rupturing the vessel wall." "This violates standard procedure," one medic objected. "Standard procedure has a 60% failure rate with this injury pattern," Alara countered. "This technique pushes that down to 20%. Which would you prefer if it were your leg?" The question itself was subversive, inviting a Vlisk to consider their individual welfare above the collective efficiency of a system. Yet increasingly, Kalen noticed the medical staff were asking such questions themselves. Most challenging of all was Alara's insistence on treating human prisoners when possible. She never openly defied orders prohibiting this, but Kalen observed her performing quick, basic interventions for wounded humans when she could do so without attracting notice, stopping bleeding, administering pain relief, stabilizing fractures. "You're walking a dangerous line," he warned her privately after catching her splinting a human soldier's broken arm. "I took an oath, Captain," she replied, not bothering to deny it, "to relieve suffering wherever I find it. I won't apologize for that." "The High Command would view this as treasonous," Kalen stated flatly. Alara met his gaze with unexpected intensity. "Then why haven't you reported it?" The question lingered uncomfortably between them, because Kalen himself wasn't entirely sure of the answer. The situation reached a critical turning point when human forces deployed a new biological weapon on the Xylos front. The agent was engineered to specifically target Vlisk respiratory systems, causing rapid inflammation and often death by asphyxiation. Conventional Vlisk countermeasures proved ineffective and casualties mounted at an alarming rate. In the midst of this crisis, with the field hospital overwhelmed by gasping, dying soldiers, Alara made a breakthrough. Drawing on her knowledge of both human bioweapon research and Vlisk physiology, she identified the mechanism of action and rapidly developed a treatment protocol using existing medical supplies in novel combinations. The pathogen binds to receptor sites in the bronchial membrane, she explained to Colonel Drav and a hastily assembled team of Vlisk medical officers. Your standard antivirals can't reach those sites effectively, but if we aerosolize this compound and deliver it via direct inhalation, it will block the binding process long enough for natural immune responses to activate. The treatment wasn't a perfect cure, but reduced the mortality rate from nearly 90% to less than 30%. Within hours, word of the human doctor's miracle had spread throughout the Vlisk forces on Xylos. In the aftermath, as the immediate crisis subsided and the battlefield settled into an uneasy stalemate, Ilera approached Kalen with a proposal that would change everything. I want to establish a neutral medical zone, she said without preamble. A space where wounded from both sides can receive treatment without fear of capture or execution. Kalen stared at her, momentarily speechless. You're proposing we treat human enemies with the same resources we dedicate to our own soldiers. I'm proposing we recognize that medicine transcends the battlefield, Ilera countered. It's not just morally right, it's strategically sound. Create a precedent for humane treatment, and your own captured personnel will benefit. The High Command would never approve such a proposal, Kalen said, though he found himself considering the idea more seriously than he would have thought possible months earlier. Then don't frame it as humanitarian, Ilera suggested pragmatically. Present it as an intelligence-gathering opportunity. A chance to study human physiology up close, to develop more effective weapons. You would help us develop weapons against your own kind? Kalen asked skeptically. Ilera's expression hardened. Of course not. But I would save lives on both sides while buying time for cooler heads to prevail. War isn't sustainable, Captain. Not for the Vlisk, not for humanity. Someone has to take the first step towards something different. Against his better judgment, against all his training and indoctrination, Kalen found himself advocating for Ilera's proposal. He carefully framed it in terms the High Command might accept: intelligence value, propaganda opportunities, experimental medical research, while privately acknowledging the deeper truth. Something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of the conflict. To his surprise, the High Command approved a limited test of the concept. Perhaps they saw the strategic advantages Kalen had emphasized, or perhaps, he sometimes thought, there were others in the command structure who had begun to question the sustainability of the war as currently waged. Whatever the reason, a small neutral medical facility was established in a demilitarized zone near the main battlefield. Under strict security protocols and constant surveillance, Ilera was permitted to treat wounded from both sides, assisted by a carefully selected team of Vlisk medical personnel. The facility quickly became known among Vlisk troops as the Crimson Healer's Den, a reference to the human blood that Ilera worked to save alongside the silvery blood of Vlisk soldiers. Some whispered the name with hope, others with suspicion, but all with a kind of reverent fear. For in saving lives that Vlisk doctrine declared expendable, Ilera Vance had become a figure of profound disruption. What most disturbed the Vlisk security apparatus was not the medical care itself, but the interactions it necessitated. Vlisk medics working alongside Ilera began to adopt her techniques, learning to treat injuries more effectively. In turn, they shared insights about Vlisk physiology that helped her refine her approaches. More dangerously, they began to talk. The human patients respond to pain differently than our soldiers, a Vlisk medic observed during a debriefing session that Kalen monitored. Their physiological response is similar, Ilera corrected gently, but they're culturally permitted to express suffering more openly. Your soldiers feel the same pain. They've just been conditioned to suppress its expression. Such conversations, multiplied across hundreds of interactions, slowly eroded the otherness that had made the war psychologically sustainable. Vlisk medics began to see human patients not merely as enemies, but as beings capable of suffering, and by extension, deserving of compassion. This contamination, as Vlisk security classified it, spread beyond a neutral facility. Reports filtered in from other fronts of Vlisk medical personnel showing concerning behavioral anomalies, delaying the euthanasia of severely wounded low-ranking soldiers, questioning triage decisions based on rank rather than medical condition, applying techniques learned from human medicine even when contrary to Vlisk protocols. Most alarmingly, there were isolated incidents of what security classified as medical insubordination, medics refusing orders that contradicted their emerging sense of medical ethics. 6 months after the establishment of the neutral facility, Kalen was summoned to a secure briefing with General Xyrox, the overall commander of Vlisk forces in the sector. The human doctor has become a significant security concern, Xyrox stated without preamble. Intelligence analysis indicates she is the focal point of an ideological infection spreading through our medical corps. Dr. Vance has contributed substantially to improved medical outcomes, Kalen pointed out carefully. The survival rate for complex battlefield injuries has increased by 37% since the implementation of her techniques. The issue is not her technical competence, Xyrox replied coldly. It is the philosophical contagion she represents. She undermines the foundational principles of our society: hierarchical efficiency, strategic resource allocation, and absolute devotion to collective goals over individual welfare. Kalen couldn't dispute this assessment. He had witnessed the transformation firsthand, not just in others, but in himself. Where once he had seen perfect logic in the Vlisk system of valuing lives according to their utility, he now found himself troubled by the casual disposal of low-value individuals. "What does High Command propose?" he asked carefully. "Elimination of the source," Xyrox replied. "The human doctor will be removed, and all personnel who have worked closely with her will undergo intensive reindoctrination. The neutral medical facility will be closed." "Removed," Kalen repeated, a cold sensation spreading through his chest. "You mean executed?" "Precisely. A regrettable necessity, but containment protocols for ideological contamination are clear." Kalen maintained his outward composure through the remainder of the briefing, but his mind raced with implications. The order was to be executed in 3 standard days, following the arrival of a special security detachment from the core worlds. For the first time in his career, Captain Kalen contemplated disobeying a direct order. The night before the security detachment was due to arrive, Kalen visited Alara at the neutral facility. She was working late, as usual, reviewing patient charts at a terminal in the quiet administrative section. "Captain," she acknowledged him with a nod. "Checking up on your troublesome asset?" "Something like that," he replied, ensuring no surveillance devices were active in the immediate vicinity. "We need to talk, Dr. Vance. About your future." Alara set aside her work, suddenly alert to his tone. "That sounds ominous." "A security detachment arrives tomorrow," Kalen said quietly. "They have orders concerning you that I find problematic." Understanding dawned in her eyes. I've finally become too much of a liability." "You've become a symbol," Kalen corrected. "A representation of ideas that threaten the structural integrity of Vlisk society. Compassion, equality, the inherent value of all life," Alara listed calmly. "Dangerous concepts indeed." "Mock if you wish, but the threat is real," Kalen insisted. "Not just to you, but to everyone you've influenced. The order includes reindoctrination for all medical personnel who've worked closely with you." Alara's expression darkened. "Meaning what, exactly?" "Neural recalibration. Personality adjustment. Essentially, the removal of the ethical framework you've instilled." "Mind control," she translated flatly. "You're going to erase everything they've learned about being better doctors, better people." "I didn't say I agreed with the order," Kalen replied carefully. Alara studied him intently. "What exactly are you saying, Captain?" It was the moment of commitment, Kalen realized. The point at which abstract ethical questioning transformed into concrete action. "I'm saying that after serving the Dominion loyally for my entire life, I find myself unable to execute this particular order." "You're going to help me escape?" Alara asked, disbelief evident in her voice. "No," Kalen replied. "I'm going to help you finish what you started." The plan they formulated that night was audacious, relying as much on the changes Alara had already wrought in Vlisk society as on their own actions. While Kalen couldn't directly countermand the orders from high command, he could ensure that key personnel were positioned to make critical choices when the moment came. When the security detachment arrived the next day, they found Kalen waiting at the landing pad, the perfect image of Vlisk military propriety. Commander Thrix, he greeted the leader of the security team. "Welcome to Xylos. Your timing is fortuitous. We're experiencing a medical situation that requires immediate attention." "Our orders are specific, Captain," Thrix replied stiffly. "The human asset is to be secured immediately." "Of course," Kalen agreed smoothly. "However, there's been an outbreak of an unidentified respiratory agent in the main barracks. Several high-ranking officers have been affected. Dr. Vance is currently working on a treatment protocol." Commander Thrix hesitated, caught in the conflict between his direct orders and the potential danger to valuable personnel. "How serious is the outbreak?" 3 deaths already," Kalen reported grimly, "including Colonel Mez of Tactical Command." This was, strictly speaking, true, though the deaths had occurred over the previous week from combat injuries, not any respiratory ailment. The implied threat to the command structure, however, had the desired effect. "We will secure the human doctor after she has addressed this medical emergency," Thrix decided. "Lead the way, Captain." Kalen led the security team not to the neutral facility where Alara actually was, but to the main Vlisk field hospital. There, right on cue, Dr. Sarvin met them with evident agitation. "Captain, the situation is deteriorating," he reported. "We have 27 new cases showing symptoms." "Where is the human doctor?" Thrix demanded. "Working in Laboratory 3, Sarvin replied smoothly. "She believes she's identified the pathogen's mechanism of action." As the security team was diverted into the hospital's labyrinthine interior, Kalen slipped away to execute the next phase of the plan. By the time Commander Thrix realized he'd been misdirected, events were already in motion that could not be easily stopped. At the neutral medical facility, Alara had gathered the core group of Vlisk medical personnel who had worked most closely with her, 15 doctors and technicians who had most thoroughly embraced her ethical framework. "The High Command has ordered my execution and your re-indoctrination," she told them bluntly. "Captain Kalen has bought us some time, but ultimately, we face a choice: submit to a system that devalues life, or take a stand for the principles of medicine as we've come to understand them." "What you suggest is mutiny," one doctor said softly. "I suggest that healing is not compatible with a system that calculates the value of a life based on its utility," Alara replied. "I suggest that what you've learned here, seeing patients as people first, not as components of a war machine, is worth defending." "And if we stand with you?" another asked. "What then?" "Then we become the pebble that starts an avalanche," Alara said simply. When Commander Thrix and his security team finally reached the neutral facility, they found not a single human doctor to arrest, but a unified front of Vlisk medical personnel. Not just the 15 Alara had spoken to, but dozens more who had heard of the planned purge through the facility's informal communication network. "Stand aside," Thrix ordered. "This is a direct command from High Command." Dr. Sarvin, who had slipped away from a main hospital to join his colleagues, stepped forward. "With respect, Commander, we cannot comply. Our medical oaths preclude cooperation with actions that would harm patients or compromise care." "Medical oaths?" Thrix's facial scales rippled with disbelief. "You speak of human concepts as if they apply to Vlisk duty." "They apply to medicine," another doctor stated firmly, "regardless of who practices it." Thrix signaled his security team to move forward, but they found their path blocked by more medical personnel. Not through physical resistance. No Vlisk had actually taken up arms, but through the moral authority the medical staff now projected. To forcibly remove them would require violence against unarmed medical officers, a line that even Thrix's security team seemed reluctant to cross. In the midst of this tense standoff, Kalen arrived, accompanied by several high-ranking patients who had benefited from Alara's care, including a general who outranked Thrix. "What is the meaning of this disruption, Commander?" the general demanded. This facility is saving Vlisk lives. Sir, I have direct orders regarding the human asset. Dr. Vance, the general corrected sharply, has just developed a treatment that saved my life and the lives of my command staff. Whatever orders you have can wait until after this medical crisis is resolved. It was a temporary reprieve at best, but it bought precious time. And time, Kayla knew, was working in their favor. Every day that Alara continued practicing medicine, treating patients without regard to rank or species, the ideological infection she represented spread further through the Vlisk military hierarchy. Over the next several weeks, a strange stalemate developed. The security detachment remained on Xylos, technically still tasked with apprehending Alara, but increasingly hampered by a web of bureaucratic delays, medical emergencies, and the quiet resistance of Vlisk personnel at all levels who had come to value the human doctor's work. What had begun as a localized ethical challenge had evolved into something broader, a fundamental questioning of the principles that had governed Vlisk society for millennia. The rigid hierarchy, the calculated value of lives based on utility, the subordination of individual well-being to collective efficiency, all were now subjects of quiet but intense debate throughout the military establishment on Xylos. Meanwhile, the war itself had reached a critical impasse. The Vlisk offensive had stalled, not just due to human resistance, but because of mounting personnel issues within the Vlisk forces. Medical insubordination had spread to other areas of operation. Officers reported increasing difficulty in enforcing orders that needlessly endangered troops. The carefully maintained psychological framework that had made Vlisk soldiers willing to sacrifice themselves without question was showing cracks. 3 months after the failed attempt to eliminate Alara, Kalen received a secure communication from Admiral Vex, a member of the High Strategic Command who had once been his direct superior. The situation on Xylos has become untenable, Vex stated without preamble. The ideological contamination has spread beyond containment parameters. High Command is divided on the appropriate response. The medical outcomes speak for themselves, Admiral, Kalen replied carefully. Casualty recovery rates have improved by 60%. Combat effectiveness of returned personnel has increased. At what cost, Captain? Vex's voice carried an unusual note of philosophical inquiry. The structures that have maintained Vlisk dominance for millennia are being undermined from within, all because of one human doctor's dangerous ideas. Perhaps, Kalen suggested cautiously, if these structures can be so easily undermined, they were already failing to serve their purpose. There was a long silence before Vex responded. There are those in high command who would have you executed for such a statement, Captain, and others who privately share your assessment. The war is becoming unsustainable, Kalen pressed, seizing the opening. Not because we lack the military capacity to continue, but because our own forces are increasingly questioning its necessity. And you attribute this directly to the human doctor's influence? I attribute it to the power of her ideas, Kalen corrected. Ideas that found fertile ground because they addressed fundamental contradictions in our approach to warfare and governance. Another long pause. High Command has authorized me to offer you a choice, Captain. Eliminate the source of contamination personally. Execute the human doctor with your own hand, and you will be fully rehabilitated, your career preserved. Refuse, and you will share her fate. Kalen had been expecting something like this, but the stark nature of the choice still sent a chill through him. When do you require my answer, Admiral? You have one standard day, Captain. Choose wisely. Kalen found Alara in the surgery wing of the neutral facility, just completing a complex procedure on a human soldier. Despite the ongoing tensions, the facility had continued to function, becoming a strange island of peace in the midst of the war zone. Your security escort seems agitated today, Alara observed as she washed the blood, both human red and Vlisk silver, from her hands. More than usual. I've received new orders, Kalen said quietly, ensuring they weren't overheard. Concerning you. Alara's expression remained calm, but he saw the subtle tensing of her shoulders. I imagine they're not offering me a promotion. I've been ordered to execute you personally, Kalen stated bluntly. Or share your fate. To his surprise, Alara actually smiled, a small, tired curving of lips. So it's finally come to that. The ultimate test of which you value more, your career or your conscience. It's not that simple, Kalen protested. This isn't just about you or me. It's about the future of the Vlisk Dominion itself. Isn't that always the justification for atrocities? Alara asked quietly. The greater good, the necessary sacrifice. She dried her hands methodically. What will you do, Captain? It was the question that had consumed him since receiving Admiral Vex's ultimatum. The logical choice, the one his lifelong training dictated, was clear. One life, even his own, was a small price to pay for the stability of an entire civilization. And yet, what was your intent? He asked suddenly. When you began all this, treating Vlisk patients against protocols, teaching our doctors your methods, establishing this facility, was it a deliberate attempt to undermine our society? Alara looked genuinely surprised by the question. No, Captain. I'm a doctor, not a revolutionary. I just did what I was trained to do. Treat the wounded, relieve suffering, value life above all else. She paused, considering. But perhaps that perspective is revolutionary in a society built on the principle that some lives matter more than others. You must have known the risk you were taking, Kalen pressed. Of course, she acknowledged. But refusing to help someone I could save, that wasn't an option for me. It never has been. She met his gaze directly. Just as I suspect executing me isn't really an option for you anymore. Not the person you've become. The truth of her words resonated uncomfortably. Kalen was no longer the same Vlisk officer who had captured Alara from that damaged human transport. The certainties that had defined his existence, the rightness of the hierarchy, the necessity of calculated sacrifice, the supremacy of collective efficiency over individual worth, had been systematically dismantled by watching this human doctor at work. If I refuse their order, he said slowly, it won't end with just my execution. They'll send others, more ruthless than I. They'll eliminate everyone who's sided with you. The contamination will be purged with maximum efficiency. Perhaps, Alara agreed. Or perhaps the contamination has already spread too far. Perhaps there are others in your high command who have begun to question, just as you did. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. The old ways are failing, Captain. Not because I undermined them, but because they were always built on a foundation that couldn't last, the denial of our shared capacity for suffering and compassion. In that moment, Kalen made his decision, not through careful tactical calculation, but through the recognition of a truth he could no longer deny. Come with me, he said. There's something I need to show you. He led Alara to his private quarters, dismissing the security escort with a formal command that brooked no argument. Once they were alone, he activated a secure communication terminal. What I'm about to do constitutes high treason against the Vlisk Dominion, he told her frankly. But I believe it may be the only way to prevent a catastrophe. Kalen established a direct link to Admiral Vex, bypassing normal communication protocols. When the Admiral's image appeared on the screen, his expression registered surprise at seeing Alara standing beside Kalen. I see you've made your choice, Captain, Vex said coldly. Not the choice you offered, Kalen replied. I propose an alternative. The human doctor and I will present ourselves to High Command in person. She will explain her methods, her philosophy, and demonstrate the results. High Command can then make a fully informed decision about the future direction of the Dominion. This is highly irregular, Vex objected, but Kalen detected a note of interest beneath the formal disapproval. So, is the situation we face, Kalen countered. The war has reached a stalemate. Our forces are increasingly divided internally. Continuing on our current path leads to collapse, not defeat by human hands, but disintegration from within. And you believe this human holds the solution? Vex's tone was skeptical, but not dismissive. I believe she represents a perspective we need to consider, Kalen replied carefully. Not as a replacement for Vlisk values, but as a necessary evolution of them. There was a long silence as Vex considered the proposal. Finally, he said, There are elements within high command who might be receptive to such a presentation. Others will call for your immediate execution. I'm aware of the risk, Kalen acknowledged. As am I, Alara added quietly. But the alternative is continued bloodshed on both sides. Another long pause. Very well, Vex decided. You will be granted safe passage to Central Command. What happens after your arrival will depend entirely on the persuasiveness of your case. His image disappeared as the communication ended. He's taking an enormous risk, Alara observed. Why would he do that? Because the contamination has spread further than you know, Kalen replied. The questions you've raised about the value of life, about the sustainability of our system, they've reached the highest levels of our hierarchy. Vex himself has lost a son in this war. A low-ranking son, deemed expendable by the same calculus he's enforced his entire career. The journey to Vlisk Central Command was tense, but uneventful. Alara spent much of it preparing for what might be the most important presentation of her life, and possibly her last. Kalen, for his part, reached out to every contact and ally he had cultivated during his long military career, seeking support for what amounted to a radical reorientation of Vlisk society. When they finally stood before the High Command, 12 of the most senior military leaders of the Vlisk Dominion, Kalen felt a strange calm. Whatever happened now, he had chosen a path aligned with truths he could no longer deny. Speak, human, the Supreme Commander ordered after the formal introductions had been completed. Explain why we should not simply execute you as the source of dangerous ideological contamination. Alara stepped forward, her small human figure seemingly fragile before the imposing Vlisk leaders, yet carrying herself with quiet dignity. Esteemed leaders of the Vlisk Dominion, she began, I come before you not as an enemy, but as a healer who has had the privilege of treating both human and Vlisk patients. What I've learned through this experience is that beneath our obvious differences, we share fundamental similarities, not just in our biology, but in our capacity for suffering, for courage, and for compassion. She proceeded to present detailed medical data showing the improved outcomes of her approach, the increased survival rates, the higher return-to-duty percentages. But more powerfully, she spoke of individual cases, Vlisk soldiers of all ranks who had been saved by techniques that defied conventional Vlisk medical protocols. The foundation of my approach is not sentimentality, she explained, shrewdly appealing to the Vlisk value of practical efficiency. It's the recognition that every life has inherent potential. The soldier you classify as expendable today might, with proper treatment, become the one who turns the tide of battle tomorrow. The rigid hierarchical valuation of lives isn't just ethically problematic, it's tactically inefficient. The High Command listened in silence, their expressions unreadable to human eyes. But Kalen, who had spent a lifetime learning to interpret Vlisk nonverbal cues, could sense the impact of her words. When Alara finished speaking, the Supreme Commander turned to Kalen. And you, Captain, you were tasked with containing this human's influence. Instead, you appear to have become its advocate. Explain yourself. Kalen straightened to his full height, embodying the military discipline that had defined his life. Supreme Commander, my primary duty has always been to the long-term survival and prosperity of the Vlisk Dominion. What I have witnessed over the past year has convinced me that our current path leads to neither. He detailed the growing fractures within the military structure, not just in the medical corps, but throughout the ranks. The increasing reluctance to sacrifice lower-ranked personnel unnecessarily. The quiet questioning of strategic decisions that valued efficiency over life. We face a choice, Kalen concluded. We can attempt to purge this contamination through executions and neural recalibration, which I believe will only drive the discourse underground and accelerate our internal collapse. Or we can recognize that evolution is not weakness, it is survival. We can incorporate these principles in a way that strengthens rather than diminishes what the Vlisk Dominion has always stood for: order, excellence, and endurance. The debate that followed among the High Command was intense and often technical, focusing on military readiness, resource allocation, and the philosophical underpinnings of Vlisk society. Throughout it all, Ilara remained composed, answering questions with the same direct competence she showed in surgery. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the Supreme Commander delivered their verdict. What began as a contamination has become a mutation, he stated. And in biology, mutations are not inherently destructive. They're the means by which species adapt to changing conditions. The High Command has determined that certain aspects of the human doctor's approach may be selectively integrated into Vlisk practices under carefully controlled conditions. It was not a complete victory, but it was a beginning. The neutral medical facility on Xylos would be officially sanctioned and expanded. A limited ceasefire would be implemented to allow for the exchange of wounded. And most significantly, a diplomatic channel would be open to explore the possibility of a negotiated end to the conflict. As they left the High Command chamber, Ilara turned to Kalen with a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. "It's more than I expected," she admitted, "but still just a first step." "First steps are how all journeys begin," Kalen replied, "particularly the difficult ones." In the months that followed, the tentative ceasefire expanded into formal peace negotiations. The changes within Vlisk society continued, not as a revolutionary upheaval, but as a gradual evolution. The rigid hierarchy remained, but grew more flexible, with merit increasingly valued alongside rank. The medical corps led the way, with Ilara's principles of universal care becoming standard practice, eventually spreading to other sectors of Vlisk civilization. Ilara herself became a figure of both controversy and reverence among the Vlisk. Some still viewed her as a dangerous subversive who had weakened their society. Others saw her as the catalyst for necessary change. To the soldiers whose lives she had saved, regardless of rank or species, she was simply the Crimson Healer. Kalen, having resigned his military commission, found himself in the unexpected role of diplomatic liaison between Vlisk and human authorities. In a private conversation with Ilara before she was finally allowed to return to human space as part of a prisoner exchange, he reflected on the strange journey they had shared. "When I first captured you, I thought you were just another human, emotional, inefficient, fundamentally alien to our way of thinking," he told her. "I never imagined you would transform our entire society." "I didn't transform anything," Ilara corrected him gently. "I just treated the wounded, all of them, as beings worthy of care." The Vlisk transformed themselves because somewhere beneath all that rigid hierarchy, you already understood the truth. "What truth?" Kalen asked. "That compassion isn't weakness," Ilara said simply. "It's strength. The kind of strength that builds civilizations that last, rather than ones that collapse under their own cold efficiency." She smiled. The seeds were already there, waiting for the right conditions to grow. As Ilara boarded the transport that would take her home, a group of Vlisk medical officers stood at attention in formal salute, a gesture of respect previously reserved only for the highest-ranking commanders. The peace that followed remained fragile, the integration of Ilara's principles into Vlisk society incomplete and contested. But the fundamental shift had begun, a subtle but profound reorientation of a civilization that had prided itself on unchanging strength. In the historical archives of both species, she would become known by many names. The Crimson Healer, the doctor who ended a war, the most feared healer alive. But to those who had worked alongside her, human and Vlisk alike, she was simply Ilara, the doctor who had reminded them all of a truth as old as medicine itself, that in the care we provide to others, we define who we truly are.